The period known as the Dark Ages in Europe began not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow and painful collapse of the ancient world. For centuries, the Roman Empire had been the backbone of European civilization. Its roads connected distant lands, its laws maintained order, and its cities were centers of trade, learning, and culture. Yet by the late 4th and early 5th centuries, this powerful system began to weaken. Internal corruption, economic strain, political instability, and relentless pressure from invading groups gradually eroded Roman authority. When the Western Roman Empire finally fell in 476 CE, Europe entered a long era of uncertainty, fragmentation, and transformation, an age later called the Dark Ages. The fall of Rome did not mean that civilization suddenly disappeared overnight. However, it did mark the end of centralized governance in Western Europe. Roman emperors no longer ruled from grand palaces, and the once mighty legions that protected the empire's borders were gone. Without Roman administration, cities lost funding, roads fell into disrepair, and trade networks collapsed. Many urban centers shrank or were abandoned altogether as people fled to the countryside in search of safety and food. Life became local, isolated, and deeply uncertain. One of the most defining features of the early Dark Ages was the wave of migrations that swept across Europe. Germanic tribes such as the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Franks, Angles, and Saxons moved into former Roman territories. These groups were often labeled barbarians by Roman writers, but in reality they possessed their own complex cultures, laws, and traditions. Some sought land and stability, while others were pushed westward by the advance of the Huns from Central Asia. These migrations reshaped Europe's political and ethnic landscape forever. The Visigoths were among the first to challenge Roman dominance. After years of conflict, they famously sacked Rome in 410 CE, an event that shocked the Roman world. Though the city itself was no longer the empire's capital, its symbolic importance was immense. The sack of Rome sent a clear message: the old order was crumbling. Eventually, the Visigoths established a kingdom in what is now Spain and southern France, blending Roman traditions with their own customs. Meanwhile, the Vandals crossed into North Africa and captured the wealthy city of Carthage. From there, they controlled vital grain supplies that once fed Rome. In 455 CE, the Vandals sailed to Italy and looted Rome again, further weakening what little remained of Roman authority. These invasions did not simply destroy, they transformed. Roman institutions survived in fragments, merging with the traditions of new rulers to create something entirely different. As Roman power faded, literacy and education declined sharply in Western Europe. Roman schools closed, libraries were neglected, and many classical texts were lost or forgotten. Latin, once the language of administration and scholarship, slowly evolved into regional dialects that would later become modern European languages, such as French, Spanish, and Italian. For ordinary people, reading and writing became rare skills, mostly preserved by the clergy. The Christian Church emerged as one of the few institutions capable of providing continuity during this chaotic time. While emperors and governors disappeared, bishops and monks remained. Churches became centers of community life, offering spiritual guidance as well as practical support. Monasteries played a crucial role in preserving knowledge, as monks carefully copied religious texts and occasionally classical works by hand. Without their efforts, much of ancient learning might have vanished entirely. Christianity also helped unify fragmented societies. Missionaries traveled across Europe, converting kings and tribes to the new faith. When rulers adopted Christianity, their people often followed. This process helped create shared beliefs and moral values across diverse regions. However, the Church was not merely a spiritual force, it also became a political power, owning land, collecting wealth, and influencing rulers. In the absence of strong central governments, Europe began to organize itself around local power structures. This marked the early development of feudalism,
though it would not fully form until later centuries. Land became the most valuable resource, and those who controlled it held power. Kings granted land to nobles in exchange for loyalty and military service. Peasants worked the land, offering labor and crops in return for protection. While this system provided some stability, it also reinforced inequality and bound people to rigid social roles. Daily life during the early Dark Ages was harsh and unpredictable. Most people were peasants who lived in small villages and depended entirely on agriculture. Agricultural techniques were basic, and crop failures could lead to famine. Disease was common, and medical knowledge was limited. Life expectancy was low, and survival depended heavily on weather, harvests, and local security. For many, life revolved around the rhythms of nature and the teachings of the Church. Trade, once vibrant under Roman rule, declined dramatically. Long-distance commerce became dangerous due to banditry and the lack of maintained roads. Coins became scarce, and barter replaced money in many regions. Luxury goods such as silk, spices, and fine pottery were rare, available only to the elite. As a result, Europe became economically isolated, with each region largely dependent on its own resources. Despite these hardships, the Dark Ages were not a time of complete stagnation. New cultures and identities were forming beneath the surface of chaos. Germanic law codes were written down for the first time, blending oral traditions with Roman legal concepts. New kingdoms emerged, such as the Frankish kingdom in Gaul, which would later give rise to France. These early states laid the foundations for medieval Europe. The Frankish king Clovis played a particularly important role in shaping the future. By converting to Christianity around 496 CE, he gained the support of the Church and the Roman population of his kingdom. This alliance strengthened his rule and set a pattern that future European kings would follow. Religion and kingship became deeply intertwined, shaping European politics for centuries. While Western Europe struggled, the Eastern Roman Empire, known today as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive. Centered in Constantinople, it preserved Roman law, administration, and culture. The Byzantines saw themselves as true Romans and acted as a bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds. Their survival highlights that the Dark Ages were not universal, but largely a Western European experience. By the end of the 7th century, Europe had changed beyond recognition. The world of marble cities, imperial authority, and Roman unity was gone. In its place stood a patchwork of kingdoms bound together loosely by Christianity and local traditions. Though life was harder and knowledge more limited, this era was not merely a time of darkness. It was a period of transition where the seeds of medieval civilization were quietly being planted. The Dark Ages, especially in their early phase, were defined by loss, but also by transformation. Old systems collapsed, yet new ones slowly emerged. The fall of Rome marked the end of antiquity, but it also opened the door to a new Europe, shaped by faith, land, and evolving identities. In the shadows of decline, the foundations of the Middle Ages were being laid, preparing the continent for the dramatic changes yet to come. By the 7th century, Europe had fully entered a new phase of its history. The Roman world was now a distant memory, remembered only through broken ruins, fading laws, and stories passed down by the Church. In its place stood a fragmented continent of small kingdoms, tribal lands, and rural communities. Power was no longer centralized. Instead, it was scattered among kings, nobles, bishops, and warriors. This era of the Dark Ages was defined not only by hardship, but by adaptation, as Europeans learned to survive in a world without imperial protection. One of the most important developments of this period was the gradual formation of feudalism. With no strong armies to protect vast territories, rulers depended on personal loyalty rather than formal institutions. Kings granted land to powerful nobles in exchange for military service and allegiance. These nobles, in turn, controlled local regions and offered protection to the people who lived there. Land became the foundation of wealth, power, and survival. Unlike Roman times when money and trade dominated, medieval Europe relied on agriculture and land ownership. At the bottom of this system were the peasants, who made up the majority of the population. Most lived as serfs, bound to the land they worked. They farmed fields, raised livestock, and paid rent through labor and crops. In return, they received protection from local lords during times of war or invasion. Life for peasants was physically exhausting and uncertain. A poor harvest, harsh winter, or outbreak of disease could mean starvation. Yet despite these hardships, village life created strong communal bonds where survival depended on cooperation. Castles and fortified manors began to dominate the landscape as insecurity became a constant threat. These structures were not merely homes for nobles, but symbols of authority and defense. Built on hills or near rivers, castles provided refuge during attacks and served as administrative centers for surrounding lands. Their presence reflected a world where violence was common and protection was essential for survival. Religion remained the most powerful unifying force in Dark Age Europe. Christianity shaped every aspect of life, from birth to death. The Church provided moral guidance, education, and a sense of order in a chaotic world. Bishops and abbots often held as much influence as kings, sometimes even more. Monasteries became islands of stability, where monks followed strict routines of prayer, labor, and study. These religious communities preserved literacy and knowledge during a time when education was rare. Monks played a crucial role in copying manuscripts by hand, preserving religious texts as well as works of ancient Greek and Roman authors. This slow and painstaking process ensured that classical knowledge was not completely lost. Monasteries also served as centers of agriculture, medicine, and charity, helping local populations during times of famine or illness. In many regions, the Church was the only institution capable of organizing large-scale efforts for social support. While Western Europe struggled with fragmentation, new threats emerged from beyond its borders. From the north came the Vikings, skilled sailors and fierce warriors from Scandinavia. Beginning in the late 8th century, Viking raids terrorized coastal and river communities. Monasteries, rich with treasure and poorly defended, were frequent targets. Viking longships could travel deep inland via rivers, striking suddenly and disappearing just as quickly. These attacks intensified the sense of fear and instability across Europe. However, the Vikings were not merely destroyers. Over time, many settled in the lands they once raided. In England, they established the Danelaw, influencing local laws and culture. In France, Viking leader Rollo was granted land by the Frankish king, forming what would become Normandy. These settlers blended with local populations, contributing to Europe's cultural and genetic diversity. Their presence reshaped political boundaries and forced European rulers to adapt their defenses. From the south, Europe faced another powerful force, the expansion of Islam. Following the rise of Islam in the 7th century, Muslim armies rapidly conquered vast territories, including North Africa and parts of the Iberian Peninsula. By 711 CE, much of Spain was under Muslim rule. Islamic civilization brought advanced knowledge in science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. While conflict existed between Christian and Muslim worlds, there was also cultural exchange, especially in Spain, where learning flourished under Islamic rule. Trade, though limited compared to Roman times, slowly began to revive during this period. Markets reappeared near castles and monasteries, allowing local exchange of goods. Merchants traveled cautiously, often under the protection of armed escorts. Rivers became important trade routes connecting inland regions. Although long-distance trade was rare, these early efforts laid the groundwork for economic recovery in later centuries. Kingship during the Dark Ages was fragile and often unstable. Without professional armies or bureaucracies, rulers depended heavily on personal loyalty. Succession disputes were common, leading to frequent wars between rival claimants. Kingdoms rose and fell quickly, their borders constantly shifting. Despite this instability, some rulers managed to strengthen their authority and bring relative order to their realms. Among these rulers, Charlemagne stands out as a towering figure. King of the Franks, he expanded his kingdom through military conquest, uniting much of Western and Central Europe. In 800 CE, he was crowned emperor by the Pope, symbolizing the revival of imperial authority in the West. Charlemagne supported education, church reform, and lawmaking, initiating what is known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Though his empire did not last long after his death, his reign marked a turning point in the Dark Ages. Daily life during this period remained deeply connected to nature and religion. Time was measured by seasons, bell towers, and religious festivals, rather than clocks or calendars. Superstition and belief in miracles were widespread, as people sought explanations for disease, disasters, and death. The Church taught that suffering on earth would be rewarded in heaven, offering comfort in a harsh world. Women's roles varied depending on social class. Noble women managed estates, arranged marriages, and sometimes ruled in their husband's absence. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields and cared for families. In convents, women could gain education and influence unavailable elsewhere. Though society was male-dominated, women played essential roles in sustaining communities. By the 10th century, signs of gradual change were becoming visible. Invasions slowed, settlements grew more secure, and agricultural techniques improved. The heavy plow and three-field system increased food production, allowing populations to rise. With greater stability came the possibility of growth, learning, and cultural development. The Dark Ages were not merely a time of decline, but a long struggle for survival and identity. Europe adapted to the loss of Roman order by creating new systems rooted in land, faith, and personal loyalty. Though life was often brutal and uncertain, these centuries forged the foundations of medieval Europe. From feudal bonds to Christian unity, from Viking settlements to emerging kingdoms, the shadows of the Dark Ages slowly gave way to the dawn of a new era.
By the beginning of the 10th century, Europe stood at the edge of profound transformation. The centuries of chaos that followed the fall of the Western Roman Empire had slowly begun to ease. Viking raids diminished, Magyar invasions were pushed back, and Muslim expansion into Western Europe stabilized. These changes allowed societies to breathe, rebuild, and look beyond mere survival. Although the scars of the Dark Ages were still visible, the foundations of a new and more structured Europe were taking shape. One of the most important developments of this period was the gradual return of stability. Stronger kingship emerged as rulers learned from centuries of fragmentation. Monarchs began to consolidate power, establish clearer lines of authority, and enforce laws more effectively. While feudal relationships still dominated political life, kings increasingly asserted control over nobles, reducing constant internal warfare. This shift did not happen overnight, but it marked the beginning of centralized governance that would later define medieval kingdoms. Agriculture experienced a quiet revolution that transformed daily life. The widespread use of the heavy plow allowed farmers to cultivate dense northern European soils more efficiently. The three-field system replaced older farming methods, rotating crops to preserve soil fertility. These innovations increased food production, reduced famine, and supported population growth.
With more reliable harvests, communities became more stable, and surplus food allowed some people to pursue occupations beyond farming. As populations grew, villages expanded into towns, and towns gradually evolved into cities. Markets became regular features of urban life, drawing merchants, craftsmen, and travelers. Trade routes reopened, connecting regions that had long been isolated. Rivers such as the Rhine, Danube, and Seine became vital commercial arteries. Though trade was still modest compared to Roman times, it represented a significant step toward economic revival. With economic growth came social change. A new class of artisans and merchants began to emerge, challenging the traditional dominance of landowning nobles. Guilds formed to regulate trades, protect workers, and maintain quality standards. These organizations fostered cooperation and provided social security for their members. The rise of towns introduced a new dynamic into European society, where wealth and influence were no longer based solely on land ownership. The Church continued to play a central role in shaping Europe's transformation. However, it too underwent reform. Corruption, political interference, and moral decline within the clergy had weakened the Church's authority during earlier centuries. In response, movements such as the Cluniac and later Gregorian reforms sought to restore spiritual discipline and independence from secular rulers. These reforms strengthened the Church's moral leadership and reinforced its influence across Europe. Monasteries remained centers of learning and innovation. Scriptoria preserved ancient texts, while monastic schools educated clergy and occasionally lay people. Over time, cathedral schools expanded, laying the groundwork for Europe's first universities. Education slowly regained importance, and intellectual curiosity began to flourish. Scholars studied theology, philosophy, law, and medicine, drawing upon both classical sources and new ideas from the Islamic world. Cultural exchange played a crucial role in Europe's awakening. Through contact with Islamic Spain, Sicily, and the Eastern Mediterranean, Europeans encountered advanced knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Translations of works by Aristotle, Galen, and other ancient thinkers re-entered Western Europe, sparking intellectual revival. This exchange demonstrated that the Dark Ages had not isolated Europe entirely, but had prepared it for renewal through interaction. Political life also evolved as kingdoms became more defined. England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire emerged as recognizable political entities. Though borders were still fluid, these realms developed administrative structures, legal systems, and identities that endured for centuries. Royal courts became centers of governance and culture, supporting poets, scholars, and artists. Warfare did not disappear, but it changed in nature. Knights, bound by codes of chivalry, became central figures in medieval warfare. Castles transformed from simple fortresses into symbols of noble power and prestige. Though violence remained a reality, the emphasis on honor, loyalty, and service reflected society's attempt to impose moral order on conflict. Religion continued to shape the worldview of medieval Europeans. The belief that history unfolded according to divine will influenced politics, art, and daily life. Pilgrimages became popular expressions of faith, with thousands traveling to sacred sites such as Rome, Canterbury, and Santiago de Compostela. These journeys encouraged cultural exchange and strengthened a shared European identity. The Crusades, beginning at the end of the 11th century, marked a dramatic turning point. Though driven by religious zeal, they were also shaped by political ambition and economic opportunity. The Crusades connected Europe more directly with the wider world, exposing Europeans to new cultures, goods, and ideas. While the conflicts were violent and controversial, their long-term impact on trade, knowledge, and cultural awareness was profound. Art and architecture reflected Europe's changing spirit. Romanesque churches with their thick walls and rounded arches symbolized strength and faith. Later, the Gothic style emerged, emphasizing height, light, and intricate design. These structures were not only places of worship, but expressions of communal pride and spiritual aspiration. By the 12th century, it was clear that Europe had moved beyond the darkest phase of the Dark Ages. Population growth, economic revival, intellectual renewal, and political consolidation signaled the dawn of the High Middle Ages. The world of isolated villages and constant fear gave way to a more connected and confident society. The Dark Ages were not simply an era of decline, but a long journey of transformation. From the ruins of Rome arose a new civilization shaped by resilience, faith, and adaptation. The struggles of these centuries forged Europe's identity, laying the foundations for modern nations, institutions, and culture. What began in darkness ended in renewal, proving that even the most difficult periods of history can give rise to profound rebirth.
By the 13th century, the term Dark Ages no longer described the reality of Europe's condition. Yet the legacy of those centuries continued to shape every aspect of medieval life. The shadows that followed the fall of Rome had slowly lifted, revealing a continent transformed. What emerged was not a return to the ancient world, but something entirely new, a civilization forged through struggle, adaptation, and resilience. The final phase of the Dark Ages was less about survival and more about understanding, memory, and the long-lasting impact of the past. The political landscape of Europe had matured significantly. Kingdoms such as England and France developed stronger institutions of governance, including royal courts, taxation systems, and written laws. Kings no longer ruled solely through personal loyalty, but increasingly relied on administrative structures. This shift reduced the chaos of earlier centuries and allowed rulers to exert authority over larger territories. Though feudal bonds remained important, the balance of power slowly moved toward centralized rule. Law and justice became more formalized during this period. Earlier systems based on local customs and trial by ordeal gave way to written legal codes and court procedures. Roman law, preserved in the Byzantine Empire and rediscovered in Western Europe, influenced legal thinking and governance. Universities began to teach law as an academic discipline, producing trained administrators who served kings and cities alike. This legal revival strengthened political stability and social order. The Church, having survived centuries of turmoil, now stood at the height of its influence. The papacy asserted authority over kings and emperors, shaping European politics and moral life. Cathedrals dominated city skylines, symbolizing both religious devotion and civic pride. Monastic orders expanded their reach, founding hospitals, schools, and centers of charity. Religion was no longer merely a refuge in times of fear, but a powerful force guiding society's values and ambitions. Education and learning experienced remarkable growth. Cathedral schools evolved into universities in cities such as Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. These institutions attracted students from across Europe, fostering intellectual exchange and debate. Scholars engaged deeply with philosophy, theology, and science, blending Christian thought with rediscovered classical knowledge. This intellectual awakening owed much to the preservation efforts of monasteries during the Dark Ages, proving that even in times of decline, seeds of progress had been planted. Economic life also reflected the long-term effects of Dark Age adaptation. Trade networks expanded across Europe and beyond, connecting cities through land and sea routes. Merchant families gained wealth and influence, challenging traditional noble dominance. Banking, credit systems, and commercial law developed to support growing economies. Markets and fairs became vibrant centers of exchange, transforming Europe into a more interconnected and dynamic society.
Urban life flourished as cities grew in size and importance. Town charters granted citizens rights and freedoms, encouraging self-governance and civic identity. Craft guilds regulated production, maintained quality, and provided social support. These urban institutions contrasted sharply with the isolation of early Dark Age villages, demonstrating how far Europe had progressed. Cities became centers of innovation, culture, and political influence. Cultural expression during this period reflected both continuity and change. Literature expanded beyond religious texts to include poetry, romances, and historical chronicles. Stories of knights, heroes, and moral ideals captured the imagination of audiences across Europe. These works often blended Christian values with older traditions, preserving echoes of the past while shaping new cultural identities. Art and architecture reached new heights, particularly in the Gothic style. Cathedrals with soaring spires, stained glass windows, and intricate sculptures represented humanity's desire to reach toward the divine. These monumental projects required cooperation among artisans, patrons, and communities, symbolizing collective achievement. The artistic achievements of medieval Europe were built upon techniques and knowledge preserved through the Dark Ages. The memory of the Dark Ages itself became part of Europe's historical consciousness. Later scholars, particularly during the Renaissance, viewed the period as a time of ignorance and decline, contrasting it with the achievements of classical antiquity. However, this perspective oversimplified a complex era. Modern historians recognize that the Dark Ages were not uniformly dark, but varied widely across regions and centuries. They were a time of transformation rather than stagnation. The influence of the Dark Ages extended beyond Europe's borders. Interactions with the Islamic world, Byzantium, and Asia shaped European development. Trade, diplomacy, and conflict connected Europe to a broader global context. These connections enriched European culture and knowledge, preparing the continent for future exploration and expansion. Social structures continued to evolve as well. While feudalism remained influential, its rigid hierarchies began to soften. Opportunities for social mobility increased, particularly in cities and through education. Though inequality persisted, society was no longer as fixed as it had been during the early Dark Ages. Change, once feared, became a source of possibility. The legacy of the Dark Ages can be seen in Europe's institutions, values, and identity. The emphasis on community, faith, and resilience shaped medieval society and left lasting marks on modern Europe. Legal systems, universities, and political traditions all trace their roots to adaptations made during these centuries of challenge. In reflecting on the Dark Ages, it becomes clear that they were not merely a historical gap between two brighter eras. They were a crucible in which Europe was reshaped. The collapse of Roman order forced societies to innovate, adapt, and rebuild from the ground up. Out of uncertainty came new forms of governance, belief, and culture. By the end of this long journey, Europe stood prepared to enter a new age of confidence and creativity. The lessons learned during the Dark Ages about survival, cooperation, and transformation remained embedded in European civilization. What once seemed like a descent into darkness ultimately became the foundation for renewal, proving that history's most challenging periods often give rise to its most enduring achievements.
By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, Europe stood at a historical crossroads. The world that had emerged from the Dark Ages was no longer defined by isolation, fear, and fragmentation, yet it had not fully entered the brilliance of the Renaissance. Instead, Europe existed in a complex transitional phase, shaped equally by the hardships of the past and the promise of the future. The legacy of the Dark Ages continued to influence institutions, beliefs, and daily life, even as new forces pushed society toward transformation.
One of the most significant changes during this period was the growing confidence of European societies. Centuries of survival had taught communities how to adapt to crisis. Agricultural improvements ensured more stable food supplies, allowing populations to grow steadily. Villages expanded into towns, and towns evolved into powerful cities that challenged the authority of feudal lords. Economic life became more dynamic, with trade networks stretching across the Mediterranean, the North Sea, and beyond. These developments were the direct result of gradual recovery that began during the later stages of the Dark Ages. Political power also continued to evolve. Monarchs strengthened their authority by building bureaucracies, collecting taxes, and enforcing laws through royal courts. Feudal loyalty, once the backbone of political order, slowly gave way to more centralized systems of governance. Kings began to rely less on personal bonds with nobles and more on written laws and professional administrators. This shift laid the groundwork for the modern state, even though medieval structure still dominated society. The Church remained a powerful force, but its role became more complex. While it continued to guide spiritual life, it also faced growing criticism. Corruption, wealth accumulation, and political involvement led many to question the moral authority of religious leaders. Reform movements emerged within Christianity, calling for a return to simplicity and spiritual purity. These debates reflected a broader change in mindset, as people increasingly sought explanations beyond tradition and authority. Education expanded significantly during this period, building upon foundations laid during the Dark Ages. Universities flourished as centers of learning and debate. Scholars studied theology, law, medicine, and philosophy, often engaging critically with ancient texts. The rediscovery of classical works encouraged new ways of thinking, emphasizing logic, observation, and reason. This intellectual revival did not reject faith, but sought to understand the world more deeply through both belief and inquiry. The influence of the Dark Ages on learning was profound. Without the preservation of texts by monks and scholars during earlier centuries, this revival would not have been possible. Manuscripts copied in dimly lit monasteries now circulated among students and thinkers, fueling intellectual growth. Knowledge that had once been fragile and hidden became increasingly accessible, setting the stage for cultural transformation. Art and literature reflected Europe's changing identity. While religious themes remained dominant, artists began to explore human emotion, individuality, and the natural world with greater depth. Writers chronicled history, romance, and moral lessons, blending imagination with observation. These creative expressions marked a shift away from purely symbolic representation toward a more human-centered perspective, a key characteristic of the coming Renaissance. Urban life played a crucial role in this transformation. Cities became hubs of innovation, commerce, and culture. Merchant families gained wealth and influence, often rivaling traditional nobility. Banking systems developed to support trade, enabling large-scale economic activity. Urban citizens demanded rights and representation, leading to new forms of self-governance. These developments weakened feudal structures and empowered individuals in unprecedented ways. Despite progress, Europe still faced significant challenges. Plagues, famines, and wars reminded people of the fragility of life. The Black Death, which struck in the mid-14th century, devastated populations and disrupted economies. Yet even this catastrophe revealed how far Europe had come since the darkest days. Communities responded with resilience, adopting social and economic structures to survive. The experience reinforced a growing awareness of human agency and responsibility. The memory of the Dark Ages influenced how Europeans understood their past and future. Scholars and writers began to reflect critically on history, comparing their own time with earlier periods. The idea that history moved through cycles of decline and renewal gained popularity. This perspective encouraged people to learn from the past rather than simply accept tradition. The Dark Ages were increasingly seen not only as a time of loss, but as a necessary stage in Europe's development. Cultural exchange continued to shape Europe's evolution. Contact with the Islamic world and Byzantium introduced new ideas, technologies, and artistic influences. Navigation, mathematics, and medicine benefited from this interaction. These exchanges expanded Europe's horizons and prepared it for exploration beyond its borders. The curiosity that drove these interactions was rooted in centuries of adaptation and survival. Social structures also shifted as opportunities for mobility increased. Education, trade, and urban life allowed individuals to rise beyond their circumstances of birth. Though inequality remained widespread, the rigid hierarchies of early medieval society began to soften. This gradual change reflected a deeper transformation in how people viewed identity, merit, and potential. The legacy of the Dark Ages was deeply embedded in Europe's institutions. Legal systems, universities, and political traditions all carried traces of medieval adaptation. Even as Europe moved toward modernity, it relied on structures shaped by centuries of struggle. The endurance of these institutions demonstrated the lasting impact of the Dark Ages on European civilization. By the 15th century, Europe stood on the threshold of a new era. The foundations laid during and after the Dark Ages supported a surge of creativity, exploration, and intellectual achievement. The Renaissance did not emerge suddenly or in isolation. It was the culmination of a long journey that began with the collapse of Rome. Every hardship endured, every adaptation made, contributed to this moment of renewal. In reflecting on the Dark Ages, it becomes clear that they were not merely a period to be forgotten or dismissed. They were a period of profound transformation, during which Europe redefined itself. The challenges of those centuries forged resilience, encouraged innovation, and reshaped values. What emerged was a civilization capable of growth, reflection, and change. The story of Europe's Dark Ages is ultimately a story of human endurance. From the ruins of empire to the rise of new ideas, Europe's journey through darkness led not to stagnation, but to rebirth. The lessons learned during this long passage about adaptation, cooperation, and the pursuit of knowledge continued to shape Europe long after the shadows had faded, guiding it toward a future filled with possibility and discovery.
As Europe moved deeper into the 15th century, the echoes of the Dark Ages still lingered in its collective memory. Although society had advanced far beyond the chaos that followed the fall of Rome, the experiences of those centuries continued to shape how Europeans understood power, faith, knowledge, and human nature. The Dark Ages were no longer a lived reality, but they remained a powerful influence, an era remembered, debated, and reinterpreted by later generations. One of the most lasting effects of the Dark Ages was the European understanding of authority. The collapse of Roman central rule taught harsh lessons about the fragility of political systems. As a result, medieval and early modern rulers became deeply concerned with legitimacy, continuity, and stability. Kings emphasized divine right, legal tradition, and historical lineage to justify their rule. These ideas were rooted in the fear of fragmentation that had defined the early medieval centuries. Political order was no longer taken for granted; it had to be protected and reinforced. The Church's rule during the Dark Ages left an especially deep imprint on European civilization. For centuries, Christianity had been the primary source of unity in a divided world. By preserving learning, offering social support, and shaping moral values, the Church became inseparable from European identity. Even as criticism of the Church grew in later centuries, its foundational influence could not be erased. Concepts of charity, community responsibility, and moral law were all shaped by the Church's dominance during the Dark Ages. At the same time, the Dark Ages influenced skepticism toward unchecked power. The memory of corruption, violence, and suffering led thinkers to question authority and tradition more critically. This tension between obedience and inquiry became a defining feature of European thought. Philosophers and reformers sought balance, respecting inherited wisdom while challenging abuses of power. This intellectual struggle would later fuel major movements such as the Reformation and the Enlightenment. The preservation of knowledge during the Dark Ages proved to be one of humanity's quiet triumphs. While much was lost, enough survived to allow future generations to rebuild. Monastic scribes, scholars, and teachers ensured that ancient texts endured through centuries of instability. Their efforts demonstrated that even in times of decline, individuals could safeguard civilization's intellectual heritage. This lesson became central to Europe's self-image as a guardian of learning. Language itself bore the marks of the Dark Ages. Latin, once a unifying imperial language, evolved into regional tongues shaped by local cultures and traditions. These languages became powerful symbols of identity, strengthening national consciousness in later centuries. The linguistic diversity of Europe was, in many ways, a direct outcome of political fragmentation and cultural adaptation during the early medieval period. Social values also reflected the long shadow of the Dark Ages. Community bonds, mutual obligation, and loyalty were deeply ingrained in European societies. These values emerged from centuries when survival depended on cooperation rather than institutions. Even as cities grew and states strengthened, the importance of local relationships and shared responsibility remained a defining characteristic of European life. The arts continued to draw inspiration from the medieval past. Painters, architects, and writers revisited themes of faith, heroism, and moral struggle that had defined the Dark Ages. Gothic cathedrals, epic poems, and historical chronicles served as reminders of a time when belief and endurance shaped human experience. These artistic expressions preserved emotional truths about suffering, hope, and resilience. Historians of later centuries struggled to define the Dark Ages accurately. Renaissance scholars often viewed the period as a cultural decline, separating them from the glory of antiquity. This interpretation emphasized loss and ignorance, reinforcing the idea of darkness. Modern historians, however, have challenged this view, emphasizing continuity, adaptation, and creativity. The debate itself reflects how deeply the Dark Ages influenced Europe's understanding of progress and decline. The concept of historical rebirth, the idea that societies can recover from collapse, was shaped by Europe's medieval experience. The transition from Roman order to medieval civilization demonstrated that collapse does not mean extinction. Instead, it can lead to transformation. This lesson became especially meaningful during later crises as Europeans looked to the past for reassurance that recovery was possible. Global interactions further reshaped Europe's understanding of its medieval past. As Europeans explored and encountered other civilizations, they began to compare their own history with those of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. These comparisons highlighted both the uniqueness and the universality of human struggle. The Dark Ages became part of a broader narrative about how societies respond to disruption and change.
Education systems continued to evolve, drawing strength from medieval foundations. Universities expanded their influence, promoting structured learning and debate. The medieval emphasis on logic, theology, and law shaped modern academic disciplines. Even scientific inquiry, which would later challenge medieval worldviews, grew out of methods developed during this transitional era. The psychological impact of the Dark Ages should not be underestimated. Generations lived with uncertainty, insecurity, and fear of loss. These experiences shaped attitudes toward death, faith, and destiny. Medieval art and literature often reflected a deep awareness of mortality, a perspective born from centuries of hardship. This awareness fostered both humility and determination, influencing European culture for centuries. As Europe moved fully into the early modern period, the Dark Ages became a reference point rather than a lived reality. They served as a warning about the consequences of division and neglect, but also as a testament to resilience. Political thinkers, religious reformers, and philosophers all drew lessons from this past, shaping their visions for the future. The endurance of the Dark Ages in European memory reveals their true significance. They were not merely a gap between two brighter eras, but a formative chapter in human history. The institutions, values, and identities that emerged during those centuries continued to guide Europe long after the darkness had passed. In the end, the story of the Dark Ages is not of failure, but of transformation. From the collapse of empire to the rise of new worlds, Europe learned how to survive, adapt, and rebuild. The shadows of the Dark Ages gave depth to Europe's understanding of itself, reminding future generations that progress is rarely linear and that renewal often begins in the most difficult moments.
By the time Europe fully entered the early modern era, the Dark Ages had become a distant yet powerful memory. They were no longer experienced directly, but they lived on through institutions, traditions, beliefs, and collective consciousness. Part 7 of this long journey is not about events alone, but about understanding what the Dark Ages truly meant, why they mattered, how they shaped Europe's identity, and what lessons they left behind for future generations. The Dark Ages began with collapse, but they did not end in failure. The fall of the Western Roman Empire shattered a world that had seemed permanent. Roads crumbled, cities emptied, and centralized authority vanished. Yet human societies did not disappear. Instead, they adapted. Communities reorganized around land, faith, and local leadership. This capacity to adapt in the face of collapse became one of the most important legacies of the Dark Ages. Europe learned through hardship that civilization was not dependent on a single empire, but on people's ability to rebuild. One of the most enduring lessons of the Dark Ages was the importance of continuity. While political systems collapsed, cultural and spiritual traditions survived. Christianity provided a shared framework of meaning that connected generations across centuries. Monasteries preserved texts, rituals, and knowledge when few other institutions could. This continuity allowed Europe to maintain a sense of identity, even when the structures of power were unstable. The Dark Ages demonstrated that culture can endure even when governments fall. The concept of authority was permanently reshaped during this period. Roman imperial rule had relied on bureaucracy, law, and centralized power. After its collapse, authority became personal and localized. Kings ruled through loyalty, land, and force rather than institutions. Over time, Europeans learned the dangers of both extremes, absolute central control and total fragmentation. The political systems that emerged later reflected this balance, combining centralized authority with local traditions. This balance remains a defining feature of European governance. Faith was another defining force shaped by the Dark Ages.
Religion was not merely a belief system, it was a way of understanding suffering, uncertainty, and hope. In a world filled with disease, famine, and violence, faith offered meaning and reassurance. The church became a moral compass, a social institution, and a political power. Even when criticized or reformed, its influence remained rooted in the centuries when it had been the only stable force in society. The spiritual worldview of Europe cannot be understood without the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages also reshaped how Europeans viewed knowledge. The loss of classical learning created a deep awareness of fragility. Knowledge was no longer assumed to be permanent. It had to be protected, copied, and taught deliberately. This awareness led to a culture that valued preservation and education. Universities, libraries, and scholarly traditions emerged from this mindset. The intellectual revival of later centuries was driven by a determination never to lose knowledge so completely again. Language and identity evolved profoundly during this period. The fragmentation of Roman authority allowed regional cultures to flourish. Latin transformed into distinct languages, each shaped by local history and experience. These languages became symbols of identity and belonging. The nations of Europe did not emerge despite the Dark Ages, but because of them. Cultural diversity became one of Europe's defining characteristics, rooted in medieval adaptation. Social values formed during the Dark Ages continued to influence Europe long afterward. Loyalty, honor, duty, and community responsibility were not abstract ideals, they were survival strategies. In a dangerous world, trust and cooperation were essential. These values shaped feudal relationships, chivalric codes, and later civic traditions. Even as society modernized, these concepts remained embedded in European culture. The Dark Ages also shaped Europe's relationship with violence and conflict. War was frequent and often brutal, yet it was gradually regulated by customs, laws, and moral codes. The idea that even warfare required rules emerged from centuries of experience. This effort to impose order on chaos reflected a deeper desire for stability and justice. The medieval world's struggle with violence laid foundations for later legal and ethical systems. Memory played a crucial role in defining the Dark Ages. Later generations looked back on the period with mixed emotions: fear, criticism, admiration, and misunderstanding. Renaissance thinkers often described it as a time of ignorance to highlight their own achievements. Modern historians, however, recognize the complexity of the era. The Dark Ages were not uniformly dark. They were uneven, regional, and dynamic. Understanding this complexity has helped redefine how history itself is studied. The idea of progress was also shaped by the Dark Ages. Europe learned that history does not move in a straight line. Advancement can be followed by collapse, and collapse can lead to renewal. This cyclical understanding of history influenced European philosophy and political thought. It encouraged humility and caution, reminding societies that achievements must be protected and renewed. Global perspectives further enriched the meaning of the Dark Ages. Europe's interactions with the Islamic world, Byzantium, and later other civilizations revealed that no society develops in isolation. Knowledge flowed across borders, even during times of conflict. These exchanges challenged the notion of a closed, isolated medieval Europe and highlighted the interconnectedness of human history. The psychological legacy of the Dark Ages was profound. Generations lived with constant uncertainty, shaping attitudes toward life, death, and destiny. This awareness produced both fear and resilience. Medieval art, literature, and theology reflect a deep engagement with mortality and meaning. These themes continued to influence European thought long after material conditions improved.
By the end of this long historical arc, Europe had transformed itself completely. From the ruins of Roman cities emerged new political systems, cultural identities, and intellectual traditions. The Dark Ages were not an interruption of history, but a bridge between worlds. They connected ancient civilization with the foundations of modern Europe. In concluding this series, it becomes clear that the Dark Ages cannot be reduced to a single narrative of decline. They were a period of loss, but also of creation. They destroyed old systems, but they also gave birth to new ones. The resilience displayed during these centuries remains one of the most powerful examples of human adaptability. The true meaning of the Dark Ages lies not in darkness itself, but in what emerged from it. Europe learned how to survive without empire, how to preserve knowledge without certainty, and how to rebuild society from fragments. These lessons shaped centuries of development and continue to resonate today. The story of Europe's Dark Ages is ultimately a story of endurance. It reminds us that even when structures collapse and the future seems uncertain, human societies can adapt, remember, and rebuild. From shadow came structure, from loss came meaning, and from struggle came renewal. The Dark Ages ended not with an abrupt awakening, but with a quiet realization that civilization is not defined by perfection, but by the ability to rise again.
As Europe moved further away from the medieval world and into the age of modern scholarship, the Dark Ages took on a new life, not as lived experience, but as an idea. Part 8 explores how the Dark Ages were remembered, reinterpreted, and reshaped in the minds of later generations. This phase is less about what happened and more about how history itself was understood, judged, and used to define European identity. During the Renaissance, European thinkers looked back at the medieval centuries with a critical eye. Inspired by the art, philosophy, and science of ancient Greece and Rome, Renaissance scholars viewed themselves as heirs to a reborn classical world. In contrast, the centuries between Rome's fall and their own time were labeled a period of decline. The term Dark Ages emerged from this mindset, suggesting ignorance, superstition, and cultural stagnation. This interpretation was not neutral. It was shaped by the Renaissance desire to emphasize progress and renewal. However, this view oversimplified a complex reality. Renaissance scholars often ignored the achievements of medieval society, focusing instead on what they believed had been lost. They underestimated the importance of medieval universities, legal systems, architecture, and philosophy. By framing the Dark Ages as a failure, they strengthened their own sense of achievement. In doing so, they transformed history into a tool for self-definition rather than objective understanding. The Enlightenment further reshaped perceptions of the Dark Ages. Thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries emphasized reason, science, and individual freedom. To them, the medieval world represented the opposite: religious authority, tradition, and perceived irrationality. The Dark Ages became a symbol of what humanity should overcome. This narrative reinforced the idea that progress was linear, moving steadily from darkness toward light. Yet even during this time, cracks appeared in the traditional narrative. Scholars began to study medieval texts more carefully, discovering intellectual depth and sophistication. Philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas demonstrated that medieval thinkers engaged deeply with logic, ethics, and metaphysics. Legal scholars recognized the importance of medieval institutions in shaping modern law. Slowly, the idea of the Dark Ages as a cultural void began to weaken. In the 19th and 20th centuries, historical scholarship underwent a major transformation. Historians adopted more rigorous methods, relying on archaeological evidence, primary sources, and interdisciplinary research.
This approach revealed a more nuanced picture of the Dark Ages. Rather than a single period of decline, historians identified regional variation, continuity, and innovation. Some areas experienced hardship, while others flourished. The concept of uniform darkness no longer held. Archaeology played a crucial role in reshaping understanding. Excavations revealed thriving settlements, advanced craftsmanship, and extensive trade networks during periods once thought stagnant. Coins, tools, manuscripts, and buildings told stories of adaptation and resilience. These discoveries challenged long-held assumptions and highlighted the creativity of medieval societies. The reinterpretation of the Dark Ages also influenced how Europeans understood themselves. Instead of seeing their history as a simple progression from ancient greatness to medieval failure and modern success, Europeans began to recognize continuity. The medieval period became a bridge rather than a gap, a time when ancient traditions were transformed rather than erased. This realization fostered a deeper appreciation of cultural inheritance. National identities were also shaped by medieval reinterpretation. Many European nations traced their origins to early medieval kingdoms. England looked to the Anglo-Saxon period, France to the Franks, and Germany to the Holy Roman Empire. These connections gave medieval history political significance. The Dark Ages were no longer merely a time of decline, but a formative era in national development. Literature and popular culture further transformed perceptions of the Dark Ages. Romantic writers of the 19th century idealized medieval chivalry, castles, and heroic quests. Knights became symbols of honor and courage, while monasteries were portrayed as centers of wisdom and mystery. This romanticized vision contrasted sharply with earlier depictions of ignorance and decay. Though not always historically accurate, it reflected a growing fascination with the medieval world. Modern media has continued this trend. Films, novels, and games often depict the Dark Ages as dramatic, violent, and mystical. While these portrayals can exaggerate brutality or superstition, they also highlight the era's emotional depth and narrative power. The Dark Ages have become a canvas onto which modern societies project fears, ideals, and questions about humanity. Education systems have also evolved in how they teach the Dark Ages. Rather than presenting the period as a gap between two golden ages, many curricula emphasize transformation and continuity. Students learn about technological innovation, cultural exchange, and social organization. This approach encourages critical thinking and challenges simplistic narratives of progress. The Dark Ages have also influenced modern discussions about collapse and resilience. In times of political instability, economic crisis, or environmental change, historians and thinkers often draw parallels with the fall of Rome. The medieval experience serves as a reminder that collapse does not necessarily lead to permanent decline. Societies can adapt, reorganize, and recover in unexpected ways. This perspective has global relevance. The Dark Ages are no longer viewed solely as a European phenomenon, but as part of a broader human story. Other civilizations have experienced similar periods of transition and transformation. Comparing these experiences highlight universal patterns of adaptation, creativity, and survival. The moral lessons of the Dark Ages continue to resonate. They remind us of the dangers of inequality, unchecked power, and cultural neglect. At the same time, they demonstrate the strength of community, faith, and shared values. These lessons are not confined to the past. They remain relevant in a rapidly changing world. The reinterpretation of the Dark Ages has also reshaped historical humility. Modern scholars recognize that no era is entirely dark or bright. Every period contains contradictions, progress alongside suffering, innovation alongside loss. This understanding encourages a more balanced view of history, one that resists judgment based solely on modern values. As Part 8 concludes, the Dark Ages emerge not as a fixed label, but as a dynamic concept. Their meaning has changed over time, shaped by those who studied, criticized, and reimagined them. This evolution reflects the power of history itself, not just as a record of events, but as a conversation between past and present. The Dark Ages continue to live on, not because they were uniquely dark, but because they force us to confront fundamental questions. How do societies respond to collapse? How is knowledge preserved? How do identity and memory shape the future? In seeking answers, each generation redefines the Dark Ages anew. Ultimately, the Dark Ages remind us that history is not only about what happened, but how we choose to remember it. Through reinterpretation and reflection, the shadows of the past become sources of insight rather than fear. In understanding the Dark Ages more fully, Europe and humanity gains a deeper awareness of its own resilience and capacity for renewal.
As the study of Europe's Dark Ages moved into the modern era, historians, philosophers, and social thinkers began to see the period not only as a chapter of the past, but as a mirror reflecting challenges of the present. The collapse of Roman authority, the fragmentation of society, and the long struggle to rebuild order offered powerful parallels to modern concerns about political instability, cultural decline, and the future of civilization. Part 9 explores how the Dark Ages continue to shape modern thinking, serving both as a warning and a source of insight. One of the strongest parallels between the Dark Ages and the modern world lies in the collapse of complex systems. The Roman Empire was an interconnected structure of governance, economy, infrastructure, and culture. When it failed, the consequences were widespread and long-lasting. Modern societies, similarly dependent on global systems of trade, communication, and technology, recognize the vulnerability of complexity. The Dark Ages remind us that no system, however advanced, is immune to disruption. Political fragmentation during the Dark Ages also resonates with contemporary concerns. After Rome's fall, centralized authority gave way to competing powers, local loyalties, and frequent conflict. Today, debates over nationalism, global governance, and political polarization echo similar tensions. The medieval experience shows how fragile unity can be, but also how new forms of order can emerge from fragmentation over time. Economic decline during the early Dark Ages offers another important lesson. The breakdown of trade networks led to scarcity, inequality, and localized economies. Modern societies, though far wealthier, face their own economic vulnerabilities, financial crises, supply chain disruptions, and widening inequality. The Dark Ages demonstrate that economic systems must be adaptable and resilient to survive periods of stress. The preservation of knowledge during the Dark Ages has become especially relevant in the digital age. Medieval monks copied texts by hand, aware that knowledge could vanish if neglected. Today, information is abundant but fragile in different ways, dependent on technology, infrastructure, and access. The lesson of the Dark Ages is clear. Knowledge must be actively preserved, protected, and transmitted, not merely stored. Cultural identity during the Dark Ages was shaped by crisis. As Roman identity faded, new identities formed around language, faith, and local tradition. In the modern world, rapid change and globalization have similarly challenged traditional identities. The medieval experience suggests that identity is not fixed, but adaptive, shaped by shared experience rather than inherited structures alone. Religion's role during the Dark Ages also offers insight into modern debates about belief and meaning. In a time of uncertainty, faith provided structure, comfort, and moral guidance. While modern societies are more secular, the human search for meaning remains constant.
The Dark Ages reveal how belief systems, religious or otherwise, can stabilize societies during periods of upheaval. The Church's dual role as both a stabilizing force and a source of conflict parallels modern institutions. During the Dark Ages, the Church preserved knowledge and unity, but also accumulated power and wealth, leading to corruption and resistance. This duality reflects a broader truth. Institutions that sustain societies can also become sources of tension if unchecked. The medieval experience encourages critical engagement rather than blind trust in authority. Violence and insecurity were defining features of the Dark Ages, yet they also led to efforts to impose order through law and moral codes. Chivalry, feudal obligations, and later legal systems emerged as responses to chaos. Modern societies facing crime, conflict, and global instability continue to grapple with similar questions about justice, security, and ethical limits on power. The Dark Ages also highlight the importance of local communities. When large systems failed, survival depended on cooperation at the village and regional level. In the modern world, where global systems dominate, the value of local resilience is increasingly recognized. Community networks, local governance, and mutual support remain crucial in times of crisis. Education's revival after the Dark Ages offers hope for renewal. Universities emerged from cathedral schools, driven by a desire to understand and rebuild. Today, education remains one of the most powerful tools for recovery and progress. The medieval experience shows that learning does not disappear in times of hardship. It often adapts and reemerges stronger. The concept of progress itself is challenged by the Dark Ages. Modern narratives often assume continuous advancement, yet history shows that decline and recovery are part of the human experience. The Dark Ages remind us that progress is not guaranteed and must be actively maintained. This awareness fosters humility and responsibility in shaping the future. Environmental factors also played a role in the Dark Ages. Climate changes, poor harvests, and disease contributed to instability. Modern concerns about climate change and environmental degradation echo these challenges on a global scale. The medieval experience underscores the deep connection between human societies and the natural world. The reinterpretation of the Dark Ages has influenced how modern societies view collapse. Rather than fearing collapse as an absolute end, historians now emphasize transformation. Rome's fall did not end civilization, it reshaped it. This perspective offers a more nuanced understanding of crisis, one that recognizes both loss and opportunity. Modern political thinkers often draw on medieval history when discussing state building, governance, and legitimacy. Concepts such as rule of law, representation, and institutional continuity evolved from medieval experiments. The Dark Ages were not a void, but a laboratory of political adaptation. Popular culture's fascination with the Dark Ages reflects modern anxieties and aspirations. Stories of survival, heroism, and moral struggle resonate in an uncertain world. Though dramatized, these narratives connect modern audiences to fundamental human experiences shaped during medieval times. The Dark Ages also challenge modern assumptions about superiority. Technological advancement does not equate to moral or social perfection. Medieval societies, though less technologically advanced, developed rich cultural, ethical, and spiritual traditions. Recognizing this complexity encourages respect for the past rather than dismissal. As globalization accelerates, the Dark Ages offer a reminder of interconnectedness. Even during periods of apparent isolation, Europe remained connected to the Islamic world, Byzantium, and Asia. Knowledge, goods, and ideas crossed borders despite conflict. This historical reality counters the myth of isolated civilizations. The enduring relevance of the Dark Ages lies in their lessons about resilience.
Societies can survive collapse by adapting institutions, preserving knowledge, and redefining identity. These lessons remain vital in an era marked by rapid change and uncertainty. In reflecting on the Dark Ages from a modern perspective, it becomes clear that they are not merely a historical curiosity. They are a case study of human endurance, creativity, and transformation. The parallels between medieval and modern challenges reveal patterns that transcend time. The Dark Ages remind us that history is not a straight path towards perfection. It is a complex journey shaped by crisis and renewal. By studying this period, modern societies gain insight into their own vulnerabilities and strengths. Ultimately, the Dark Ages serve as both warning and inspiration. They warn of the consequences of neglect, division, and complacency. At the same time, they inspire confidence in humanity's ability to rebuild, rethink, and renew. In understanding the Dark Ages, the modern world gains not fear of the past, but wisdom for the future.
At the end of this long historical journey, the Dark Ages stand not as a closed chapter, but as a lens through which humanity can better understand itself. From the collapse of Roman authority to the slow emergence of medieval civilization, the Dark Ages reveal patterns that repeat across history. They show how societies respond to loss, how cultures survive disruption, and how human creativity persists even in the most uncertain conditions. Part 10 brings together the central lessons of the Dark Ages and reflects on what they ultimately teach humanity. The first and most powerful lesson of the Dark Ages is that collapse is not the end of civilization. When the Western Roman Empire fell, many believed the world they knew had vanished forever. Roads decayed, cities shrank, literacy declined, and political unity fractured. Yet beneath this surface decline, life continued. People adapted their ways of living, restructured communities, and redefined authority. Civilization did not disappear, it transformed. This lesson challenges the fear-driven belief that societal collapse must lead to permanent darkness. The Dark Ages also demonstrate that complexity creates vulnerability. The Roman world was highly interconnected, relying on long-distance trade, centralized administration, and professional armies. When these systems failed, the consequences were immediate and severe. Medieval Europe learned to survive with simpler, more localized structures. While this reduced efficiency, it increased resilience. The balance between complexity and adaptability remains one of the most important challenges facing societies today. Another crucial lesson lies in the preservation of knowledge. During the Dark Ages, learning survived not through grand institutions, but through quiet dedication. Monks copying manuscripts, teachers passing on oral traditions, and scholars preserving fragments of ancient texts ensured that knowledge endured. This teaches that intellectual survival depends not on abundance, but on commitment. Knowledge must be actively protected, especially during times of instability. The Dark Ages also revealed the power of belief systems in shaping human endurance. Christianity provided meaning in a world filled with suffering and uncertainty. Faith offered explanations for hardship and hope beyond immediate survival. While belief systems can be sources of conflict, the medieval experience shows how shared values can unite fragmented societies. Humans seek meaning as much as security, and civilizations often survive through shared narratives rather than material strength alone. Authority and governance were fundamentally reshaped during the Dark Ages. The loss of imperial rule forced Europeans to experiment with new forms of power. Kings ruled through loyalty, land, and negotiation, rather than bureaucracy alone. Over time, this led to blended systems combining centralized authority with local autonomy. The evolution of Europe reflects a broader human lesson. Governance must adapt to social realities rather than impose rigid models. The Dark Ages also highlight the importance of community.
When large institutions failed, survival depended on local cooperation. Villages, monasteries, and kinship networks became lifelines. Mutual obligation replaced abstract citizenship. This emphasis on community resilience remains relevant in modern times, especially during crises when centralized systems struggle to respond effectively. Another enduring lesson is that progress is not linear. The Dark Ages shattered the illusion of constant advancement. Technological regression occurred alongside cultural innovation. Loss existed alongside creation. This challenges modern assumptions that history naturally moves toward improvement. Instead, progress requires maintenance, protection, and renewal. Without effort, even the most advanced societies can decline. The evolution of identity during the Dark Ages offers further insight. As Roman identity faded, new identities emerged based on language, culture, and shared experience. These identities were not inherited intact, they were constructed over time. This teaches that identity is flexible rather than fixed. Societies redefine themselves in response to change, and diversity often emerges from disruption. The Dark Ages also teach humility in judging the past. For centuries, the period was dismissed as ignorant and backward. Modern scholarship has revealed its complexity, innovation, and creativity. This reminds us that historical judgment is shaped by perspective. Each era interprets the past through its own values, often misunderstanding what it does not recognize. True understanding requires patience and context. Violence and insecurity were constant during the Dark Ages, yet they also inspired moral and legal responses. Codes of conduct, religious ethics, and early legal systems emerged as attempts to limit brutality. This reflects a deep human impulse to impose order on chaos. Even in violent times, societies seek justice and restraint, proving that morality does not vanish during hardship. The role of adaptation stands at the center of the Dark Ages lesson. Europeans adapted their economies, political systems, and cultural practices to new realities. Agriculture changed, trade routes shifted, and social structures evolved. Adaptation, rather than resistance to change, ensured survival. This lesson remains essential in a world facing rapid technological, environmental, and political transformation. The Dark Ages also revealed the long-term value of patience. Recovery did not occur within a generation. It took centuries for Europe to rebuild stability, learning, and prosperity. This long timeline challenges modern expectations of quick solutions. Sustainable renewal often unfolds slowly, shaped by cumulative effort rather than sudden breakthroughs. Cultural exchange during the Dark Ages further expands its lessons. Despite conflict, Europe remained connected to Byzantium and the Islamic world. Knowledge crossed borders through translation, trade, and diplomacy. This demonstrates that isolation is rarely complete and that interaction often drives progress, even during periods of division. The psychological dimension of the Dark Ages is equally important. Living with uncertainty shaped medieval attitudes toward death, faith, and destiny. This awareness produced both fear and resilience. Human beings learned to endure without guarantees. This psychological strength became a foundation for later creativity and exploration. The Dark Ages also warn against neglecting institutions. Roads, schools, and administrative systems collapsed because they were no longer maintained. Rebuilding them required immense effort. This teaches that institutions are fragile achievements, not permanent fixtures. Their survival depends on continuous care and collective responsibility. Perhaps the most profound lesson of the Dark Ages is that meaning can emerge from hardship. Out of loss came new forms of art, belief, and social organization. Medieval cathedrals, universities, and legal traditions were born from centuries of struggle. Suffering did not prevent creation, it often inspired it. As humanity faces modern challenges, climate change, political instability, technological disruption, The Dark Ages offer perspective rather than fear. They remind us that collapse does not erase human potential. Adaptation, memory, and cooperation can transform crisis into renewal. In the final analysis, the Dark Ages were not simply a time between two brighter eras. They were a formative process that reshaped Europe's understanding of power, knowledge, and identity. The modern world is built not only on ancient achievements and Renaissance brilliance, but also on medieval endurance. The ultimate teaching of the Dark Ages is resilience. Civilizations fall, systems fail, and certainty disappear, but human beings persist. Through adaptation, shared values, and the preservation of meaning, societies rebuild themselves in new forms. The Dark Ages end not with darkness, but with continuity. They remind us that history is not about perfection, but about survival and transformation.
Although the Dark Ages are most often discussed as a uniquely European phenomenon, their deeper meaning becomes clearer when viewed in a global and comparative perspective. Civilizations across history have experienced periods of collapse, stagnation, and renewal. Europe's Dark Ages were not an exception to human progress, but part of a recurring pattern in which societies are tested, reshaped, and reborn. Part 11 explores the Dark Ages as a universal human experience and examines how Europe's recovery fits into the broader story of world civilization. When Rome fell, Europe entered a period of fragmentation and uncertainty. Yet elsewhere in the world, other civilizations were flourishing. The Byzantine Empire preserved Roman governance and learning in the East. The Islamic Golden Age advanced science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. China experienced cycles of unity and division, but maintained strong bureaucratic traditions. This contrast reveals an important truth. While one region declines, others often rise. Human knowledge does not disappear globally, it shifts geographically. This global continuity challenges the idea that the Dark Ages represented a complete collapse of civilization. Instead, they reveal how civilization is unevenly distributed across time and space. Europe's decline did not erase human progress, it temporarily relocated its centers. Knowledge preserved in Baghdad, Constantinople, and Chang'an would later return to Europe, fueling its revival. The Dark Ages thus represent a pause in one region, not a universal regression. The transmission of knowledge back into Europe highlights the importance of cultural exchange. Translations of Greek and Roman texts from Arabic into Latin reintroduced lost philosophy and science. Trade routes carried not only goods but ideas. This process demonstrates that recovery often depends on openness rather than isolation. Europe's rebirth was not purely internal, it was shaped by global interaction. The emergence of medieval institutions during the later Dark Ages marked the beginning of Europe's transformation. Monasteries evolved into centers of learning, and cathedral schools laid the groundwork for universities. These institutions did not simply restore ancient knowledge, they reorganized it. Scholasticism sought to reconcile faith and reason, creating a uniquely medieval intellectual framework. This synthesis became a foundation for modern Western thought. Political structures also evolved in response to long-term instability. Feudalism, though often criticized, provided a workable system of mutual obligation in a world without strong central authority. Over time, feudal relationships gave rise to more formal legal systems, representative councils, and early concepts of rights. The political experiments of the Dark Ages shaped Europe's future governance. The revival of cities marked another turning point. As trade slowly returned, urban centers re-emerged as hubs of commerce and culture. Markets, guilds, and merchant classes transformed social hierarchies.
Economic revival was gradual, but it signaled a shift away from purely agrarian survival toward economic specialization. This urban rebirth marked the transition from the Dark Ages to the High Middle Ages. Religion remained central to this transformation, but its role evolved. The Church expanded its influence, yet it also faced internal reform movements. Monastic renewal, debates over authority, and theological inquiry reflected a growing complexity within medieval spirituality. Faith no longer served only as comfort during hardship, it became a framework for intellectual and moral exploration. Art and architecture during the later Dark Ages reveal a renewed confidence. Romanesque churches, followed by Gothic cathedrals, demonstrated technical innovation and collective ambition. These structures were not merely religious symbols, they represented social cooperation and long-term vision. The ability to plan across generations marked a psychological shift from survival to aspiration. The Dark Ages also reshaped Europe's relationship with time. In the early medieval period, life was dominated by immediate necessity. As stability increased, societies began to think in longer horizons. Chronicles, histories, and legal codes reflected a growing awareness of continuity. This temporal expansion allowed Europe to imagine a future beyond crisis. Comparing Europe's Dark Ages to other historical declines reveals common patterns. The fall of the Maya, the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, and the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate all involved environmental stress, political fragmentation, and economic disruption. Yet in each case, recovery followed adaptation rather than restoration. Civilizations rarely return to their old forms, they evolve into something new. This understanding reframes the Dark Ages as a creative destruction rather than a void. Old systems proved unsustainable, making space for new social arrangements. While the cost was immense, the outcome was a transformed Europe capable of innovation and expansion. The Renaissance and the scientific revolution were not rejections of the Dark Ages, but their long-term consequences. The psychological transformation of Europe during this period is often overlooked. Centuries of uncertainty shaped a mindset that valued resilience, faith, and communal responsibility. These traits influenced later European exploration, colonization, and intellectual ambition. The willingness to endure hardship became a cultural strength. The Dark Ages also influenced Europe's moral framework. Concepts of duty, sacrifice, and moral order were reinforced by hardship. Ethical systems developed not in times of comfort, but in response to suffering. This moral inheritance shaped European law, philosophy, and social norms for centuries. From a global perspective, Europe's Dark Ages remind us that no civilization holds permanent dominance. Power shifts, cultures transform, and knowledge migrates. This humbling truth challenges modern assumptions of inevitability. Just as Rome fell, modern systems remain vulnerable to disruption. The lesson of recovery is equally important. Europe's rebirth was not driven by sudden genius, but cumulative effort. Farmers improved agriculture, monks preserved texts, merchants revived trade, and scholars rebuilt learning. Civilization advanced through collective persistence rather than individual brilliance. The Dark Ages also teach us that renewal often begins quietly. There was no single moment when darkness ended. Instead, small improvements accumulated over generations. This gradualism contrasts with modern expectations of rapid change, but reflects historical reality. By the end of the Dark Ages, Europe had become something fundamentally different from the Roman world. Its political fragmentation fostered competition, innovation, and diversity. Its religious institutions shaped identity and education. Its social structures balanced hierarchy with obligation. These features defined medieval Europe and influenced the modern world. In viewing the Dark Ages globally, they emerge not as a failure, but as a transformation phase. They remind humanity that decline is not shameful and recovery is not guaranteed. Both depend on choices, values, and cooperation. The Dark Ages ultimately reveal that civilization is a process, not a destination. It is built, lost, and rebuilt across generations. Each cycle leaves traces that shape the future. Europe's Dark Ages were one such cycle, painful, complex, and deeply formative. As history continues to unfold, the Dark Ages remain relevant not as a warning of inevitable collapse, but as evidence of human adaptability. They show that even in prolonged uncertainty, societies can preserve meaning, rebuild knowledge, and imagine a future beyond survival. In the end, Europe's Dark Ages were not a detour from civilization's path. They were the path itself, uneven, difficult, and transformative. Through them, Europe learned how to endure, how to change, and ultimately, how to begin again.
As Europe emerged from the long centuries traditionally labeled the Dark Ages, it carried with it more than rebuilt cities and revived learning. It carried memories of collapse, survival, fear, faith, and endurance. These memories, whether consciously preserved or unconsciously inherited, shaped the foundations of the modern European mind. Part 12 explores how the experiences of the Dark Ages influenced Europe's long-term worldview, values, and historical consciousness. One of the most enduring legacies of the Dark Ages is Europe's deep awareness of fragility. Unlike civilizations that experienced long periods of uninterrupted continuity, medieval Europe was born from collapse. The memory of Rome's fall lingered for centuries, shaping attitudes toward power and permanence. This historical trauma fostered a cautious understanding that even the greatest systems could fail. As a result, European political thought developed with an underlying tension between ambition and restraint. This awareness influenced the way Europeans approached authority. Medieval kings ruled with the knowledge that legitimacy could be challenged and lost. Power was personal, negotiated, and often temporary. Over time, this produced political traditions that emphasized contracts, oaths, and shared obligations. The seeds of constitutional thinking can be traced to this medieval distrust of absolute power, shaped by the lessons of imperial collapse. The Dark Ages also left a profound mark on Europe's relationship with history itself. Unlike classical civilizations that celebrated continuity, medieval Europe became deeply historical. Chronicles, genealogies, and sacred histories flourished. People sought to understand their present through the lens of the past, often interpreting events as part of a divine or moral narrative. This habit of historical reflection became a defining feature of European intellectual culture. Religion played a central role in shaping this historical consciousness. Christianity provided a framework that connected past, present, and future through salvation history. The suffering of the Dark Ages was interpreted not as meaningless loss, but as part of a larger cosmic story. This belief system helped Europeans endure hardship, while also encouraging moral self-examination. The idea that societies could fall due to moral failure became deeply embedded in European thought. The legacy of scarcity during the Dark Ages also shaped European attitudes toward labor and discipline. Survival required constant effort, cooperation, and patience. Work was not merely economic necessity, it became a moral value. Monastic traditions elevated labor as a form of spiritual discipline, influencing broader social attitudes. This ethic of work and endurance would later play a role in Europe's economic development. Education, though limited during the early Dark Ages, gained symbolic importance precisely because it was rare. Literacy became associated with authority, wisdom, and moral leadership. When learning revived, it carried a sense of responsibility. Knowledge was not treated as entertainment, but as a serious, almost sacred pursuit.
This reverence for learning shaped the development of universities and scholarly traditions. The Dark Ages also influenced Europe's artistic sensibility. Medieval art emphasized symbolism over realism, meaning over appearance. This reflected a worldview shaped by uncertainty, where visible reality was considered temporary and fragile. Even as artistic styles evolved, this symbolic depth remained a hallmark of European culture, influencing literature, philosophy, and religious expression. Memory of violence during the Dark Ages shaped Europe's moral imagination. Insecurity, warfare, and lawlessness forced societies to confront the limits of human behavior. In response, ethical systems developed that emphasized restraint, honor, and justice. Chivalric ideals, religious morality, and early legal codes all emerged as attempts to regulate violence and impose order. These efforts laid the groundwork for later concepts of human rights and justice. The experience of fragmentation also shaped Europe's cultural diversity. The loss of centralized authority allowed regional languages, customs, and identities to flourish. Rather than a single dominant culture, Europe became a mosaic of traditions. This diversity, born from collapse, later became a source of creativity and competition. Europe's pluralism is one of its most enduring medieval legacies. The Dark Ages also shaped Europe's relationship with nature. Agricultural survival depended on understanding seasons, soil, and climate. Environmental uncertainty fostered humility toward natural forces. This awareness influenced medieval philosophy and theology, which emphasized humanity's dependence on creation. Even as technology advanced, this legacy of environmental sensitivity remained embedded in European thought. Fear of disorder, rooted in Dark Age experiences, influenced Europe's obsession with structure and categorization. Legal systems, bureaucracies, and philosophical frameworks sought to impose clarity on a chaotic world. From canon law to scholastic philosophy, Europeans attempted to organize reality through systems of thought. This drive for order became a defining intellectual trait. The memory of loss also shaped Europe's attitude toward innovation. Change was often approached cautiously, shaped by fear of unintended consequences. Yet necessity forced innovation in agriculture, architecture, and governance. This tension between caution and creativity produced a distinctive European pattern: gradual innovation grounded in tradition. The Dark Ages left a psychological legacy of endurance. Generations lived without certainty of peace or prosperity. This fostered resilience and adaptability. Europeans learned to plan for uncertainty, a mindset that later supported exploration, colonization, and global expansion. The willingness to face risk was tempered by lessons learned from past collapse. Historical memory of the Dark Ages also shaped Europe's attitude toward other societies. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, Europeans contrasted their present with their medieval past, often portraying the Dark Ages as something to overcome. This narrative shaped ideas of progress and modernity. While often unfair to the medieval world, it reinforced the belief that improvement was possible. The reinterpretation of the Dark Ages over time reveals another important legacy: the power of historical narrative. How societies remember their past shapes their identity. The shifting view of the Dark Ages, from darkness to transformation, demonstrates how historical understanding evolves. This self-critical approach to history became a hallmark of European scholarship. The Dark Ages also influenced Europe's moral relationship with suffering. Pain and hardship were not seen solely as evils to be avoided, but as experiences that could produce meaning. This perspective influenced philosophy, theology, and literature. The idea that suffering could lead to growth became deeply ingrained in European culture. As modern Europe emerged, it carried these medieval legacies into new contexts. The nation-state, scientific inquiry, and industrialization were shaped by inherited attitudes toward authority, knowledge, and resilience. The Dark Ages were not erased by progress, they were absorbed into Europe's cultural DNA. Understanding this legacy challenges simplistic narratives of history. The Dark Ages were not merely a failure to recover Roman greatness, they were a formative period that taught Europe how to survive without certainty, how to rebuild without blueprints, and how to find meaning amid loss. In the end, the Dark Ages shaped Europe's sense of humility and ambition. They taught that greatness could be lost, but also regained in new forms. This dual awareness fueled both caution and creativity, restraint and exploration. Part 12 reveals that the Dark Ages live on not as ruins, but as memory. They shaped how Europe thinks about power, progress, and purpose. The modern European mind, with its historical awareness, moral complexity, and restless search for meaning, was forged not only in moments of triumph, but in centuries of endurance.
As Europe moved from the medieval period into the early modern era, the influence of the Dark Ages remained profound, even if largely invisible to contemporary observers. Far from being a mere period of decline, the centuries following Rome's collapse laid essential foundations for the birth of the modern world. Part 13 examines how the structures, values, and ideas forged during the Dark Ages enabled Europe to transition into a period of renaissance, exploration, and scientific advancement. The political evolution that began during the Dark Ages played a crucial role in shaping the modern European state. While the collapse of Rome initially left Europe fragmented into feudal territories, the decentralized system encouraged experimentation with governance. Kings, nobles, and local leaders developed new methods of administration, negotiation, and alliance building. Over time, these experiments evolved into stronger, more centralized monarchies capable of organizing resources, defending territories, and maintaining law and order. The modern nation-state owes much to these centuries of political adaptation. Legal systems, too, were profoundly influenced by the medieval experience. The Dark Ages forced societies to codify customary law, regulate feudal relationships, and manage disputes without centralized courts. Canon law, local charters, and early legal codes created a framework that later evolved into formalized judicial systems. European law, with its balance of authority, precedent, and community norms, has roots in these medieval innovations. Economically, Europe emerged from the Dark Ages with a renewed understanding of trade, agriculture, and urbanization. While early medieval economies were localized and survival-focused, gradual stabilization allowed for the growth of markets, guilds, and towns. Merchants and craftsmen rediscovered networks of exchange, connecting regions that had been isolated for centuries. This economic revival laid the groundwork for Europe's commercial expansion in the Renaissance and beyond. The Church, having endured centuries of instability, emerged as a powerful social and intellectual force. Its role in education, social welfare, and moral guidance persisted, shaping the values of emerging societies. At the same time, challenges to church authority, including heretical movements and intellectual critique, encouraged critical thinking and debate. These tensions between tradition and reform fostered an environment in which inquiry could flourish, a prerequisite for the scientific and philosophical revolutions to come. Intellectual life, nurtured in monastic schools and early universities, benefited from centuries of preservation and reinterpretation of knowledge. Scholars in the later Middle Ages began to synthesize classical texts with contemporary thought, producing innovations in philosophy, science, and mathematics. Scholastic methods, emphasizing logic, debate, and rigorous analysis, provided intellectual tools that underpinned modern scientific reasoning. The revival of learning was thus built upon centuries of meticulous care and incremental development. The Dark Ages also influenced European cultural identity and artistic expression. Gothic cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, and epic poetry reflected values shaped by centuries of uncertainty, faith, and community.
These cultural achievements created a continuity of aesthetic and moral sensibilities that persisted into the Renaissance. Artistic innovation was not simply a return to classical ideals, it was a reinterpretation of medieval values, blending heritage with creativity. Societal resilience forged during the Dark Ages became a defining feature of the European spirit. Communities had learned to adapt to famine, disease, invasions, and political instability. This endurance translated into practical strategies for economic, military, and cultural development in the early modern period. The capacity to survive adversity without losing identity allowed European societies to pursue ambitious projects such as exploration, colonization, and scientific discovery. The transition from oral to written culture, solidified during the medieval period, also played a central role in Europe's modernization. Literacy, record-keeping, and documentation became increasingly widespread. Written contracts, academic treatises, and chronicles facilitated communication, planning, and accountability. The written word, cultivated through centuries of careful preservation, became a key instrument of governance, commerce, and learning in the modern era. Europe's encounter with other civilizations was also shaped by lessons from the Dark Ages. Contact with the Islamic world, Byzantium, and later Asian societies introduced new knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Europeans, having experienced the fragility of their own institutions, approached these exchanges with a mix of curiosity and caution. The ability to integrate foreign ideas while maintaining a sense of identity was cultivated during the centuries of adaptation that followed Rome's fall. Social structures, shaped by the Dark Ages, evolved into more complex and fluid hierarchies. Feudal bonds gradually gave way to more centralized authority, urban citizenship, and emergent middle classes. This social mobility, though limited, allowed for greater participation in commerce, education, and governance. The diversity of social roles created a dynamic society capable of innovation and expansion. The Dark Ages also left a lasting imprint on European attitudes toward time and history. Medieval chroniclers, recording the passage of events, cultivated a sense of continuity and moral causality. Europeans came to view history not as mere cycles of kings and battles, but as meaningful narratives shaped by human choice, divine providence, and moral consequence. This historical consciousness informed political theory, literature, and philosophy in the modern period. The psychological and moral lessons of the Dark Ages were equally enduring. Generations who lived through insecurity, scarcity, and mortality developed resilience, patience, and ethical reflection. These traits shaped European approaches to governance, diplomacy, and exploration. Risk-taking, tempered by prudence, became a hallmark of European expansion and intellectual inquiry. Europe's scientific awakening was inseparable from its medieval heritage. The careful preservation of texts, the scholastic method, and the culture of debate prepared the ground for empirical investigation. Figures such as Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton built upon centuries of accumulated knowledge and methodological refinement. The Dark Ages, far from being an intellectual void, had provided the conditions for systematic inquiry and rational exploration. The period of the Dark Ages also fostered a culture of cumulative improvement. Unlike civilizations that experience sudden collapse or abrupt renaissance, Europe's recovery was gradual, iterative, and resilient. Agricultural innovations, urban development, legal reform, and scholarly work proceeded step by step, producing stable foundations for modern society. The modern world is, in part, the product of this slow, deliberate evolution. In global perspective, Europe's Dark Ages serve as a case study in recovery and adaptation. They illustrate how a civilization can emerge from fragmentation and uncertainty, rebuild institutions, and cultivate intellectual, social, and moral frameworks. These lessons extend beyond Europe, offering insight into the dynamics of human societies in any era of crisis. By the end of the medieval period, Europe had developed the essential components of the modern world: centralized states, functioning economies, educational institutions, legal systems, and cultural traditions. The resilience and ingenuity forged during the Dark Ages made this transformation possible. Without centuries of adaptation and preservation, the Renaissance and scientific revolution would have lacked the intellectual and social foundation necessary for success. The ultimate legacy of the Dark Ages is therefore dual. It is both a cautionary tale and a testament to human potential. It warns that complexity can collapse and that power, knowledge, and prosperity are never guaranteed. Simultaneously, it demonstrates that human societies can endure, adapt, and rebuild, creating new orders and new possibilities. The Dark Ages are a story of transformation, not termination. In conclusion, the Dark Ages were not merely a prelude to modernity. They were an essential phase in the shaping of the modern world. Political institutions, intellectual traditions, social structures, and cultural values were all influenced by centuries of adaptation, struggle, and perseverance. The achievements of the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the subsequent centuries of European expansion were built upon the foundation established during the Dark Ages. Europe's journey from the collapse of Rome to the birth of modern civilization demonstrates that recovery and adaptation are integral to human history. The Dark Ages remind us that resilience, innovation, and learning often emerge from adversity. They reveal that the modern world is inseparable from its medieval past, and that understanding the Dark Ages is essential for understanding Europe itself. The story of the Dark Ages, spanning centuries of disruption and renewal, ultimately offers a message of hope.
The centuries commonly referred to as the Dark Ages represent more than a mere interlude between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. They were a period of profound transformation, during which European societies rebuilt themselves from fragmentation, learned to adapt to uncertainty, and developed the foundations of modern civilization. Part 14 explores the continuity and change of this era, highlighting lessons that extend far beyond Europe, offering insights into resilience, adaptation, and human creativity across cultures. The most striking feature of the Dark Ages is the persistence of human activity amidst apparent decline. While political fragmentation, reduced urbanization, and the contraction of long-distance trade characterized much of early medieval Europe, daily life continued. Farmers tilled fields, artisans produced goods, and communities maintained social structures. This continuity demonstrates that societal collapse is rarely absolute. Even when central authority vanishes, human communities find ways to survive, maintain culture, and preserve knowledge. Trade and economic networks, although diminished, never disappeared entirely. Local markets became essential for subsistence, while regional exchanges persisted in goods, ideas, and cultural practices. Over time, these localized systems served as the foundation for more complex economic recovery. The gradual revival of trade in later medieval centuries illustrates the principle that adaptation, rather than immediate restoration, drives long-term societal resilience. The preservation and transformation of knowledge were crucial during the Dark Ages. Monastic institutions safeguarded manuscripts, copying texts and preserving both religious and secular learning. While literacy declined in broader society, scholars maintained intellectual continuity. The careful stewardship of texts, combined with oral traditions, ensured that essential knowledge survived and could later be disseminated more widely during the High Middle Ages and Renaissance. This pattern demonstrates the enduring importance of cultural and intellectual preservation during periods of instability. Religion functioned as both a stabilizing and transformative force. The Christian Church provided moral authority, social cohesion, and educational infrastructure.
At the same time, religious institutions were dynamic, evolving in response to internal reform movements, heretical challenges, and political pressures. The Church's role in preserving knowledge, mediating social disputes, and guiding ethical behavior illustrates how institutions can sustain societies during periods of uncertainty while simultaneously adapting to changing conditions. Political systems in the Dark Ages were equally adaptive. With the absence of centralized Roman authority, local and regional powers developed feudal arrangements, relying on mutual obligation, loyalty, and land tenure. These decentralized structures allowed communities to survive amid chaos, while also creating the flexibility necessary for gradual political consolidation. Over time, this evolution produced stronger, more stable forms of governance, demonstrating the interplay between necessity, adaptation, and long-term institutional development. Social hierarchy and community bonds evolved in response to the pressures of the era. Kinship networks, village structures, and guilds became essential mechanisms for mutual support. These social forms emphasized cooperation, shared responsibility, and local autonomy. The emphasis on community resilience reveals an important principle. When large-scale systems fail, smaller networks can sustain human life and culture, providing a foundation for future recovery. Cultural production continued, even in the face of material scarcity and insecurity. Architectural achievements, illuminated manuscripts, and literary works demonstrate both continuity and innovation. Romanesque churches, for example, reflected inherited Roman techniques while incorporating new stylistic and symbolic elements. Literature and epic poetry preserved cultural memory and offered moral and spiritual guidance. The persistence of artistic expression underscores that even during periods of constraint, human creativity finds outlets and contributes to long-term cultural identity. Technological and agricultural innovations emerged as responses to necessity. Crop rotation, water mills, and improved plowing techniques reflect a practical engagement with environmental and economic challenges. These developments, though incremental, laid the groundwork for later productivity gains. The Dark Ages illustrate that innovation often arises from adaptation rather than external inspiration, emphasizing the human capacity to respond creatively to constraints. The transmission of knowledge across regions and civilizations expanded during the later Dark Ages. Contact with the Byzantine Empire, Islamic scholarship, and Mediterranean trade facilitated the reintroduction of classical learning, mathematics, and science into Europe. This cross-cultural exchange demonstrates that no civilization exists in isolation, and that resilience and progress often depend on openness to external influences, even during times of internal difficulty. Education, which initially suffered decline, gradually re-emerged as a central societal value. Cathedral schools evolved into universities, emphasizing structured inquiry, debate, and intellectual rigor. The scholastic method, combining reason and faith, provided tools for systematic thought that would later underpin scientific and philosophical developments. The Dark Ages thus highlight that periods of apparent decline can incubate long-term intellectual growth through careful preservation, synthesis, and reflection. The ethical and moral framework of the Dark Ages left enduring imprints on European society. Codes of conduct, chivalric ideals, and early legal statutes reflected attempts to regulate social behavior amidst insecurity. Moral reasoning was intertwined with practical survival, emphasizing justice, honor, and communal responsibility. These foundational values contributed to the development of later European legal systems, political philosophy, and civic ethics. Europe's memory of the Dark Ages shaped its historical consciousness. Chroniclers and historians interpreted events through moral, religious, and practical lenses, cultivating an awareness of continuity, cause, and consequence. This reflective approach to history fostered critical thinking, narrative construction, and self-awareness, traits that became central to European intellectual culture. Understanding the past was seen not merely as recording facts, but as extracting lessons for governance, morality, and survival. From a global perspective, the Dark Ages provide broader lessons about resilience and adaptation. Civilizations across time and space have faced collapse, environmental change, and social disruption. The European experience demonstrates that survival often depends on local initiative, institutional preservation, cultural continuity, and cross-cultural exchange. It also shows that recovery rarely follows a linear path. Societies rebuild in stages, often combining old structures with innovative adaptations. Environmental and demographic factors influence the course of the Dark Ages. Climatic fluctuations, disease, and agricultural limitations affected population distribution, economic stability, and social organization. Human responses to these challenges reveal adaptive strategies that combine technological, social, and cultural innovations. Lessons from the Dark Ages suggest that environmental awareness and flexible adaptation are essential for long-term societal resilience. The Dark Ages also shaped European attitudes towards risk, uncertainty, and future planning. Having experienced systemic collapse, European societies developed strategies for contingency, cautious governance, and incremental progress. These traits would influence economic practices, exploration, scientific inquiry, and political strategy in subsequent centuries, embedding a pragmatic approach to uncertainty in European culture. By the end of the medieval period, the cumulative effects of adaptation, preservation, and gradual innovation positioned Europe for rapid transformation. Political centralization, urban revival, educational expansion, and cross-cultural exchange created the conditions for the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the emergence of modern nation-states. These developments were rooted in the lessons learned during the centuries traditionally called the Dark Ages. In conclusion, the Dark Ages exemplify the dynamic interplay between continuity and transformation. They reveal how societies endure, adapt, and evolve in response to collapse, uncertainty, and environmental pressures. The period demonstrates that human creativity, resilience, and cultural memory persist even under adverse conditions. Far from being merely a time of stagnation, the Dark Ages were formative, shaping the foundations of modern European society and providing enduring lessons for civilizations everywhere. Ultimately, the study of the Dark Ages offers insights not only into European history, but into the broader patterns of human civilization. They show that decline and renewal are inseparable processes, that adaptation and preservation are essential for survival, and that even in the most challenging